Hey everyone, Ross Marchand here, Director of Policy for the Taxpayers Protection Alliance, and to talk about all things mail and postal policy, I have with me today none other than Heritage Foundation's very own David Ditch. David, thanks for taking the time to chat with me today.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, there is so much afoot in terms of postal policy. And I never thought, when I first heard about all of this coronavirus stuff, let's say like a month ago or 6 weeks ago, I never thought that at this time we would be talking about USPS and bailouts and whatnot. So let's start at the beginning. The CARES Act, which was signed into law a couple of weeks ago. What kind of assistance did that legislation afford the Postal Service?
There was a bit of a debate about that. When the CARES Act was initially put together in the Senate, it didn't include funds for postal. The House came back with a proposal that would have included a pretty substantial bailout, lots of loans, debt relief, grants, and there was a compromise between the House and the Senate versions where the final bill included a $10 billion loan, which would cover the Postal Service's losses related to coronavirus for the next several months.
Right. And you saw some interesting things. I'm just going to call them weird things related to that $10 billion in extended borrowing authority given to the Postal Service. Saying, for example, they have to set up temporary delivery locations, and they could only allocate the $10 billion towards operational expenses. And the most strange part to me, they have to somehow prioritize medical supplies over non-medical supplies. I don't really understand. Like, could you make heads or tails of that, or is that equally perplexing to you?
This isn't a surprise to me when I look at some of the other strings attached to targeted loans for other sectors of the economy. For example, one of the other things I follow is transportation, and airlines had all sorts of red tape that they have to follow, in many cases based purely on political priorities rather than on urgent needs. In this case, for example, is the Postal Service going to leave vital medical supplies just laying on a warehouse floor for the next month? I mean, they
Right.
deliver things when they can deliver them, so I'm not sure exactly what that would entail. And then as far as the other things go, again, I think it's a way to focus the loan money on what is the priority. I mean, frankly, there are other things that the Postal Service could theoretically spend $10 billion on that would not be particularly helpful. Right now, the core responsibility is doing what they do day in, day out, and making sure that that continues through the duration of the crisis. And the loan does accomplish that.
Sure. And $10 billion seems like, compared to revenues, it seems like a pretty modest amount of money, especially because it's a loan and not a grant. But now, with this most recent round of discussions for the latest relief, the fourth relief package, which is currently being discussed now, that may include more than $75 billion in taxpayer dollars to the Postal Service. But what have you heard about that? And that, I mean, at least to me, that sounds like way too much money. That's about, what, a year of revenue for USPS?
It's frankly astronomical, and it's clearly an example of political opportunism. Right now, a lot of members of Congress have stopped worrying about debt and deficits. To a certain extent, understandably, we want to make sure that the economy doesn't totally collapse while the private sector is largely shut down. That doesn't mean we need to give a blank check to the Postal Service, which is what $75 billion would entail. It's not as though the Postal Service is shut down. The mail is still going through. People are still requesting packages. They still need package deliveries. That business is still very healthy throughout the economy, and there's no reason to believe that postal revenue is down by so much that they need to recoup every single penny that they would normally get
Right.
over the course of the year. Instead, what this $75 billion mega bailout is really about is giving the Postal Service free rein to not work on any necessary reforms for the next several years. It would be canceling their remaining debt obligation, and it would be kicking the can down the road for a couple of years, not indefinitely, just a couple of years. And then, unfortunately, they'll be facing bankruptcy once again unless we actually meaningfully change the way it is structured.
Right. And those would be real strings attached. I mean, a lot of this problem, and no one is talking about this, by the way. Of course, the media is conveniently overlooking this, but a lot of USPS's problems predate the pandemic. And this operating model that USPS has been operating under for more than a decade is just fundamentally broken. So, what steps can we take in the here and now, or even a little bit down the road, to make sure that the Postal Service is getting back on proper footing?
It is absolutely essential that any additional relief for Postal Service passed, whether it's this package or a subsequent package sometime during the next 3 to 4 months, must come with reforms that change the structure of USPS, that
Mhm.
also change the mandates. A lot of what the Postal Service does is based on statute. It is, after
Sure.
all, an independent government agency, and Congress mandates certain things which make it hard for Postal Service to lower its own operating expenses. So, for example, the Postal Service has to deliver the mail 6 days a week. Frankly, with the steep drop in mail volume, in frankly the demand for mail over the last 20 years, due to the spread of electronic communications, there's much less need for 6 days of mail delivery. We could drop that to 3, 4, or 5 days a week, which would save on the expense of drivers and vehicles. We could close down a lot of small, underused post offices because, once again, the foot traffic in post offices is well down over the last 20 years. We can consolidate the buildings. We'd have less structural costs in terms
Sure.
of renting or maintaining these businesses or these locations. Wouldn't have to employ quite as many clerks. There are
Mhm.
various reforms along these lines that could make the Postal Service much more streamlined, that would make it much more sustainable for the long term. But again, it's up to Congress to act.
Right. Now, we want to read more about this and talk about next steps forward for USPS. Your website is what, heritage.org? Do I have that right?
Yes, I have an author's archive at heritage.org. Two of my top view pieces are on Postal Service, and my colleague James Cattuso and I, along with Romina Baccia, will be working on a paper that should be out in the next 2 weeks.
Well, you guys have been producing some great work. You could also visit our website, protectingtaxpayers.org. We released a report last year detailing some of the steps that USPS could take to get its fiscal house back in order. And we found that if USPS took some of these steps, they could save more than $3 billion a year and take significant steps to get back on firmer fiscal footing. Well, thank you so much, David. And we'll have to stay tuned to see what USPS does and what lawmakers do in this upcoming round of relief. Thank you.
Great to speak with you, Ross.
Take care.